This is Larry Jordan, the host of the Digital Production Buzz. The following interview is an excerpt from a recent program. To hear the entire program, visit digitalproductionbuzz.com. Craig Ratcliffe is a commercial and advertising photographer shooting subjects as diverse as food and jewelry to landscape and industrial locations. Based in Brisbane, Australia, he has more than 40 years' experience in the competitive world of photography. He's experienced and transitioned from film to digital during his career, as well as a vast sea change in how photographs are taken and consumed. Hello, Craig. Good to have you with us.
Hi there, Larry. Love to be here.
It's good to have you with us. We've got
a bit of echo here.
Well, at this point, you're bouncing off the walls of our studio. Craig, what got you started in photography?
My father was actually a very successful commercial photographer and advertising photographer in Sydney, Australia. I grew up in and around photographic studios. The smell of photographic studios. I was even a child model on many occasions.
Well, fathers do that to their kids on a regular basis.
They certainly did. Well, I had every intention of being a rock and roll star when I was 15, but my father had other ideas for me. So,
well, I think that your photography career got you to meet most of the rock and roll people in the world. It would seem to me.
I've met a lot of people in my career, from prime ministers of Australia to leading actors in Australia. I've certainly photographed quite a few musicians in my time as well.
You got started when you were 15, if I remember reading correctly on your blog. What I'm interested in, before we talk about the process of photography, is as you think back to your father mentoring you, what was one of the most important lessons you learned about the business of photography from him?
It's basically communication. It's talking to your client. It's actually, I've got to say myself now that the best photographs in the advertising industry are taken with your ears. You must listen to your client. You must see what they see and interpret what they see visually. That's probably the most important thing I could advise anybody. I never consider myself exactly an artist. I'm an interpreter of other people's visions.
Well, when it comes to interpretation, some of the images on your website are just stunning. I mean, glorious is the only word that I can use to describe exposures that I would die to get on my gear. It's just some amazing stuff. But what was your specialty shooting? Because you've covered so much stuff. What were you starting off shooting when you first began?
Look, I learned a very hard school of photography. I was probably 8 years before I started shooting myself. My father, within the first couple of shoots I did with him as a very young man, as a 15-year-old, I sat down in a chair during a shoot. I never sat down again. Never in my life did I sit down again, and I still don't. It was up, get out of that chair. And probably with words I can't express here, but I don't really sit down anymore. There's always something to do. There's always something to do in a studio. There's always more you can do to a photograph. That's probably in the end analysis, when you're taking a photograph, you've got to find that point when, particularly in still life, where with complex images like, say, jewelry, there comes a point where you must be satisfied with what you've created. But then again, you can always go further. It's this magic moment you go.
Well, the thing I like is that many of the images I looked at look so natural and look so unartificial. That it looks like there's no special light. It looks like they're just sitting there looking, whether it's a lifestyle photograph of a model or food which looks edible or a car which doesn't have any speculars gleaming off. It looks the way you would expect it to look, which has got to take forever to light.
It does. I'm getting much better at it, and that we've got having moved into the digital era. I tend to move my subjects around into a position where they work visually in a lighting aspect. My main focus is to make things look natural. so that the human eye interprets it well. It's there's instances where, particularly in modern photocomposites, where you might see a view out of a window, which is there's far too much detail in. The human eye isn't going to see that. It's going to interpret that as looking like a mural if there's too much detail, and then too much detail in the room. And it's just that magic balance, I suppose, has just taken years to perfect.
You talk about,
and I do it with my eyes.
you talk about making your images look natural, and when you talk about people looking natural, some of the images that you have on your website of corporate CEOs, office people, these are not necessarily professional models. These are amateurs. How do you get them to behave the way that you want them to behave so it's natural?
There's a number of ways I do that. One is that I totally expose myself, as in that sounds
That's
delightful.
good. Nothing more need be said.
I have no inhibitions when I speak to people. I tend to make myself, let's say, the funny guy in the room, the stupidest guy in the room, so the person I'm photographing doesn't feel inhibited, because I've made a bit of a goose of myself. Then they don't feel that way. I'm the goose. Or I might just find out something they're interested in, and I'm well read, maybe. I'm not that well read, but I know a lot of stuff about a lot of things, from sport to politics to anything. So I can actually discuss something with them and completely take them off guard usually. And a lot of those shots will be done when people may be actually doing their job.
Do you actually spend a lot of time with them before you actually push the shutter button, and or do sometimes you don't have the time, you just have to make them feel comfortable?
Usually these days there's no time.
Yeah.
I'll walk into an office and I just get them. It's almost like shock. But I might also get them from a distance long lens when they're not aware of my presence. I might take the shot, set up a shot, do the shot, but then as I'm leaving, get the shot when they think it's over.
I was reflecting, your career began in '74, and in those days, the way you would do retouching is you would actually be marking on the transparency itself. What's it been like over the last 40 years as we make the transition into digital? Do you miss the days of being able to physically touch film and retouch the way you used to, or is it all Photoshop world and there's no going back?
Certainly, there's a lot I miss about conventional or non-digital photography, and that's probably the reward of picking up your photograph, and it's the latent image. It's that way. With digital, it's instant gratification, and that latent image that is sitting there in that roll of film, and then you don't know it's right until it comes out and you put that on a light box, and that feeling of, wow, it's great. That's what I miss. It's these days, well, look, I've got it. And I don't feel like, I just miss that a lot.
Back in those old days, did you develop your own film, or did you send it out?
Oh, well, most certainly, I built the first darkroom I ever did a black and white printing or processed any negatives in. I built myself.
Ah, cool.
Under my father's instructions. So I had to be a carpenter first. And I'm not a great carpenter, but I managed to get everything level. He had me in the darkroom virtually night and day for about 4 years. So that learning, this is something that doesn't happen today because we don't have light-sensitive materials, chemical materials. And that learning of things, how to do things in the dark, that razor, you're using a scalpel in the dark. I used to have to do that when you'd cut sheets of film.
Yeah.
I miss a lot of that. I miss the smell. Sure. The fixer, when you would walk into a photographic studio, they'd always have that odor, that background odor of fixer. And
I did this in college as part of the way to pay my tuition. I was in a dark room and I worked hours and hours and hours. And yes, the smell. I can still remember the smell, which has affected my brain, which is why I can't speak more than about 60 minutes before I start to slur.
Well, don't worry. When my father occasionally would underexpose a black and white image, I mean, I knew how to, and he taught me how to do, produce. Say, a lot of people don't understand that you can actually intensify negatives. That's a process of sepia toning using potassium ferrocyanide and potassium bromide and sodium sulfide. My fingers nails would go black.
There's your smell.
That's one hell of an odor, I can tell you.
That's why you and I would do really well in a bar.
Craig, do you find yourself planning shoots differently? Because back when you were shooting film, even though you really had, to many people, an unlimited film budget, you still didn't shoot anywhere near the number of images you shoot now digitally. Do you plan shoots differently now that they're digital?
I try not to. I try to think of it that I'm still using film. But the habit, as it is with the many photographers, is that you do overshoot. And of course, there were budgets for the amount of film you could shoot. A 120 roll of film wasn't all that cheap, and especially if you had to process it. Although I did have an E6 processor towards the end, and a photocomposite service. We would do sometimes 18-element photocomposites. I had an in-house retoucher and photocompositor. So when it came to the shift to digital, and now these days when you can work in layers, and I kind of understand it very well, because you're essentially doing the same thing. I myself don't work in layers. I do use the Photoshop as a darkroom.
I want to take you back to the days of film, because when I was reading this on your website, it's just too good not to talk about. How would you build a composite image when you were working with film? I mean, there's no digital layers in Photoshop. You're looking at different pieces of film. How would you build a composite?
Very good planning. Very good planning.
Yeah.
You would have to. You required a very good rendering by the art director or designer, which they often didn't understand that they had to do. And you say, well, this has to fit here and this has to fit there. They have to essentially give you a blueprint, if you like, that you can work around. You can't just magically put everything together. And you can get very good effects. It can work very well. And I mean, goodness, you only have to go back, 20, 25 years, and it was all traditional photo composition. There was no Photoshop.
But how would you build the composite? What was the technical process?
All right. I myself didn't do it myself. We had a compositor and a retoucher. But basically what you would do is create to scale duplicate hectochromes. So or format, say we would do our composites at about a 1411 hectochrome. You would create each hectochrome two sides, and then our retoucher would get some what was known as ruby lith film, and you'd have to cut with a scalpel around each. So you create the mask.
Jeez.
The ruby lith mask would be taken away, and then in our case, we would get the compositor to then create a soft-edged mask out of lithographic black and white film. And you could grow or shrink the edge and soften and harden the edge purely by time, temperature, agitation process. Then you took all those masks that were in black and white, put them under an enlarger, and with a pin registration board, they would be exposed one at a time. So you had a positive and a negative mask on each layer.
This was back when, 1940 something? Was it?
We were still doing this in 1990. So yeah.
And now you can do it digitally, and we do the same thing, but we only do it digitally.
Well, exactly. You are doing exactly the same thing. There's not that much difference.
Yeah.
Are you...
Except there's no smell.
Exactly right, John.
What cameras are you shooting now?
I use a Hasselblad.
Oh, my goodness.
I generally don't take that on location. And she's getting a bit old. They're very expensive cameras.
Yeah.
I'm still running on a DH2, which is the 22 megapixel,
Jeez.
which is adequate. I'm usually tethered, and I use that for my jewelry and my food photography generally. And and I also use Nikon for my field cameras. I miss the days of, and I really, really wish that someone would do something about this. I really miss my bellows. I miss my view cameras. I don't think people realise exactly what you can do with optics. Rather, quite simply, if you learn how to use a view camera.
Like the ground glass plate on a Hasselblad, you mean?
No, I meant when you're using a 5x4 camera or 10x8 camera, where you can shift front panel, shift, tilt, swing, and with all those movements, it becomes unnecessary to look. You can do it optically rather than electronically. And since Sinar basically went out of business, to my knowledge, there isn't anyone producing bellows, a view camera with a digital back. I've attempted it. I had one. I tried to build one, but
keep practicing.
I will.
There's a lot of kids that are starting out in school that would love, at the end of 40 years, to look back on a career similar to yours and feel as good about it as you do. What advice do you have for them?
Wow. It's a tough world. It's an extreme. Look, I was lucky. I've got to say I was lucky. I had an amazing photographer father. So it wasn't ever easy. But these days, my goodness, I mean, there are so many photographers out there competing against much young photographers. My own son is now a videographer, so it's gone to a third generation. And I think I've taught him pretty well, and it's the philosophy of it. It's hard work. Never. In my game, I have to forget everything for my business for what I do. I miss parties, post holidays, work Christmas Day.
Right.
You can't say no. You have to be there. You are on call. Constantly, and you've got to understand that. Also, I don't know whether you really necessarily have to take that many photographs. I think you look at the world as a photographer. I remember my dad used to say, "Give me a pair of L's." And he'd go around and look at things like this and shape and compose your images. You don't even visually remember that and do those exercises.
That's a great tip.
I teach that to all of my college kids, and they all get embarrassed saying, "How can you do this? It just makes me feel weird." And I say, "Yes, but now you're a camera." No. Finger to thumb and thumb to finger. Just getting to get their fingers in the right spot is a challenge.
Yeah, what format? Is you in CinemaScope? Yeah, Larry, that's very good of you that you do that, because look, we can go and create thousands and thousands of images that we're often not even going to look at. But you know what? If you do this and have a look at the world, that's as necessary.
And Craig, where can people go on the web to study your work and learn more about you, and hire you for that matter?
And hire you, yes.
And hire me. Well, I'm available here. I have a website at the moment. It's under. It will be redeveloped, but at the moment it's www.ratcliffephotography.com.
That's all one word, ratcliffephotography.com. And Craig Ratcliffe himself is a gentleman we've been talking with. And Craig, thanks for joining us today. It was fun.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.